All right. Oh, look. I'm not bald. Wow. What a euphoric discovery about my physiognomy. I'm not actually bald. Not entirely, anyways, but I got some hair in the front. Forge Gang! I'm still a hard man! Let's go! What's up, Soulbreaker? Alright, so I want to go down some nostalgic memory lane. What's up, interdimensional lizard? Let's talk about Jak and Dexter. The Jak and Dexter game series for PS2. It's very sad that no new Jak game has come out in 14 years or so now. There hasn't been no new Jak or Dexter themed game for 14 years. Now, to understand the history of the PlayStation, you have to pretty much go back to PS1 era. You have to go back to the PlayStation 1 era, and we have to talk about the general history of platformers. Platformers and just 3D, the concepts of 3D. In the 1990s, 3D platformers were basically the thing. Especially RPGs. Ultima, the series, there is a series of games, they're called Ultima. The first Ultima, the first Age of Darkness, came out in 1980. And it basically kick-started the sort of Dungeons and Dragons and Lord of the Rings themed RPGs. And all throughout the 80s and 90s, these kind of RPGs were very important and very significant in the overall development in the history of platformers. The PlayStation 1 took 3D graphics and put it together with platformers and created a whole new genre of platformer RPGs and MMORPGs. So, Insomniac Games, which already existed before the PS1, created Crash Bandicoot. And Crash Bandicoot was considered to be quite innovative for its time. Crash Bandicoot was, it did a lot of breakthroughs. It brought in the comical protagonist and kind of the doomsday sort of villain. It's a lot like Tom and Jerry. If you ever watch the old Tom and Jerry cartoons on television, Spyro the Dragon and Crash Bandicoot are kind of influenced on that. Not a lot of really serious character development, and just really more of the cartoony themes and stuff. So, Jak and Dexter is basically that, with the story development and the development of characters. And the fact that characters die. Characters don't really ever die in Crash Bandicoot or even Spyro. They always come back. But in Jak and Dexter, main characters actually do die. Baron Praxis dies. Don't really know what happened to Gol and Mai. But Jak's father dies. A lot of important characters die, and there is a lot of development even in the first game. So Jak and Dexter has a series, is not really the best graphics or even the best storytelling, but it actually had some pretty innovative gaming features for the time. So the first Jak and Dexter game, the precursor Legacy, you have something of a story theme where Dexter is turned into an Ottsel, and you have to travel the world, or you have to discover the world, and as you go through it, you gradually learn more and more about these ancient precursor artifacts from a lost bygone civilization that hardly nobody knows about. You learn about the 4 different color sages and the different types of eco. The boss fights are not the best. They're extremely easy to do. It's actually some of the puzzle solving and the exploration features and just kind of overall the immersion that really excites people overall. But in terms of an actual adventure, there isn't really that deep of a story. In fact, it's only until you get to the Red Sage's hut that you actually begin to really learn sort of the entire story. So basically, you're just pushed through these different puzzles and challenges. You kind of get a bit into a mystery, and then just about halfway through the game, you basically learn everything about the story, and the challenges are pretty cool, but the boss fights are not really that great. And at the end of the day, you come to this thing called a Rift Gate. You have no idea what it is, and then Jak and Dexter ends. You pick up in Jak 2 with the Rift Gate, and you finally learn more about it. And Jak 2 is actually a lot more fun. You get to have an entire range or selection of guns and morph guns, and you get to use ammo and shoot enemies and stuff. The enemies are actually fun to fight, unlike the previous game. The graphics are a little bit better, but more importantly, you get to go through an entire city. You get to steal a bunch of different zoomers, and you get to fly around on these anti-gravity vehicles. You get to beat up villains and stuff. You have a better weapon selection. You get to have dark eco, which really isn't that useful, because you have to collect a bunch of dark eco to even change, and you don't even stay in the form for very long. There's actually a very short time limit. And so it really isn't the most useful thing. So most of the time you'll be using the morph gun, and you'll be going around and you'll use different mech suits and stuff. It's kind of almost like Final Fantasy and Grand Theft Auto. In fact, actually, in sort of a way, it's a lot like Deus Ex, but with eco instead of bioelectric fluids or augmentations. It's just dark eco. The problem is that the dark eco is not really the most useful thing, and just like with the first Jak game, it kind of just leaves you with a bit of a riddle. You have no idea who Baron Praxis is, you don't know who the Middle Headmaster is, even though they appear at the start of the game. But anyways, you break out of prison, and you work for the Underground, which is run by the Shadow. Very mysterious figure known as the Shadow. And you have to protect this kid that you have no idea about anything about. The kid is so darn important, and the Middle Head leader wants him very badly. So does Baron Praxis. So, you meet up with Crew. Crew is the guy that gives you all of the different gun morphs. Now, eventually, you do find to these different points where you have to find these different ways to collect artifacts to open up the Tomb of Mar. And once you open up the Tomb of Mar, you go through the challenges of manhood, or the challenges of Mar, and then you have to fight Baron Praxis twice, and the boss fights are actually a lot more challenging, but they're not really that exciting. They're kind of boring. Most of the lesser puzzles and challenges are better. Anyway, you find the artifact of Mar, but it's stolen. And then you're doing various other things as well, and eventually you find out that the shadow is Samos the Green Sage, but a younger Samos. You also find your Samos from the first Jak game, and you have no idea what's going on or anything until later. So you have to find necessary artifacts and stuff to help the shadow of the young Samos become a green sage, which he does, and he gets his green eco powers and becomes a green sage. And eventually, you do a bunch of other stuff. Going into the catacombs or going down into the sewers is pretty interesting. There's a lot of actually really cool missions going in the sewers and whatnot. And anyways, eventually you find out that Baron Praxis is working with the Metalhead leader, and in return for giving dark eco to the Metalheads, they attack this Haven City just enough to keep Baron Praxis in power. Eventually you find out that Crew is going to sell out the city to the Metalheads, and so you go through the Crimson Guard Fortress, and you fight Crew, which is not really that great of a boss fight. Then the Metalheads invade Haven City, and your best friend, a Wastelander, dies in the catacombs, and the catacombs don't really have much importance in Jak 2, but you go through them once in Jak 2, and they're going to be a lot more important in Jak 3, which is the next game. So anyways, the Metalheads invade Haven City, Baron Praxis dies, you find out that the guy that was with the mysterious kid was the Metalhead leader the whole time, and you have to help these guys to get the rift machine up. You find out the rift gate is at the Metalhead leader's lair. So you collect a bunch of artifacts also that helps to build the rift machine to go through the rift gate, because you're going to go back into the past. The problem, though, about this is when you get to the Metalhead leader's lair, you find out that the boy is actually a younger version of Jak. And the young Samos is just a younger version of Samos the Sage. So you fight the Metalhead leader a bunch, and it's actually a pretty good fight. It's probably the only decent boss fight in the entire Jak and Dexter series. So you kill the Metalhead leader, and the young Jak and the young Samos go back in time to the precursor legacy period. They go back in time, and it turns out that Jak and Samos are from Haven City, and the future is their own time period. They only go back in time to prepare Jak to fight the Metalheads when the time comes. And so it's a time loop. So Jak 2 ends, and in Jak 3, Jak and Dexter are banished into the desert. They're banished into the wasteland, and a guy called Salmus, or whatever, brings them to Spargus. Spargus is actually the town where all the Wastelanders and those banished from Haven City live. And there is this giant star that's in the sky, and every single night the star gets brighter and shinier as it gets closer to Earth. You also find out about the precursor monks, and you do a lot of travel and exploration in the wasteland and stuff like that. So anyways, eventually you go through a set of tournaments, and you have to fight and win these tournaments, and when you do, you become a full-on wastelander, and you get full access to the wasteland. And the wasteland is full of bandits, and you have to at one point fight the bandits off from invading Spargus. Then you find one of your friends from Haven City, and they've come to tell you about the bad news of what's going on in Haven City. But I'll save that for later. So you arrive at the Precursor Temple, and Jak gets light eco powers. So in addition to Dark Jak, there is Light Jak. The time limits are a little bit longer from Jak 2, so you can actually better utilize the different Dark and Light Jak powers. And this time around, they're kind of interesting. There's one that slows down the flow of time, there's one that allows you to fly like an angel, and then there's Dark Jak powers that allow you to become invisible, to disappear or to vanish from detection from your enemies, and there's ones that allow you to use a tornado. You don't really get better morph gun stuff, but the morph guns are nicer. You also get to do a lot of different races and stuff all across the wasteland. So you get Light Jak and Dark Jak powers. You have to go through the catacombs through the entire side of the planet. You return to Haven City, and Baron Praxis' old castle has been torn down. The catacombs were opened up that lead to the center of the world. You have a new area of Haven City that is called Freedom City. One district is controlled by KG Crimson bots. Another zone is controlled by metalheads. And so you do a bunch of different missions. You get allowed back into Freedom City. You get to become one of the Guards of Honor, or the Legion of Honor. But ultimately, you have to explore the catacombs because that's where the greatest secret is at in the game. So basically, you go back and forth between Spargus and the rest of the wasteland and what used to be Haven City, but is now mostly ruins. People only live in Freedom City, the slums, and the port. And so at any rate, you do a bunch of missions, you do a bunch of things, you fight lesser boss battles. Eventually you go back to the catacombs, and the leader of Spargus dies, and just after he dies, you find out that he was your father. The leader of Spargus was the former king of Haven City, and his son, who was the boy from Jak 2, is actually you, and he was your father, and he never found out because he died. So you race into the catacombs. You find out that the precursors were Otzels the entire time, and the guy who wanted to become a precursor becomes an Otzel. Then you find out that the Dark Makers, who are corrupted precursors that became evil and became Dark Makers, are going to invade Jak and Dexter's planet. You go to the Dark Maker ship, you raid the Dark Maker ship, and then when you return to the wasteland, Errol, who you thought died during a Zoomer race in Jak 2, is now a cyborg. You fight him in the KG bot fortress in the air, and then you fight him on a Dark Maker thing and eventually kill him, and that's the end of Jak 2. But there is a very bizarre loophole at the end of Jak 3. At the end of Jak 3, Jak actually goes with the precursors back into their time, in the far ancient past, to continue their war with the Dark Makers. However, just a few seconds later, Jak appears from out of nowhere. And so, Naughty Dog leaves sort of a very mysterious secret about Jak 3 that they never have really come out and said anything about. So, that's Jak 3. Not as good as Jak 2. Actually, some good boss battles. Not really a lot of character or world building, but oh well. Jak X Combat Racing was the last game that Naughty Dog released, and it's basically just a repetition of Crash Bandicoot's racing game that they released in 1999. So Naughty Dog releases Jak X Combat Racing, and everyone is poisoned, and in order to get the antidote, you have to win the cross-city race. So you go through a bunch of races and a bunch of finales and finals, and you get to do some exploration, you get to use different weapons and stuff, and it's basically just exactly the same thing as Crash Bandicoot Team Racing, or Crash Team Racing from 1999. Then you find out who the villain is, you beat him in the last race, and that's really it. In 2006, another company released Dexter for the PSP. And Dexter, Ready at Dawn released Dexter for the PSP. And so this takes place just before the beginning of Jak 2. Dexter is a bug exterminator, and you go through some points and scenes of Haven City that you never get to really visit in Jak 2. And it's basically just Jak 2, but if you were to play it as Dexter, and if you were a bug exterminator. Eventually, you kill all the metal bugs, and then you kill the metal bug leader, so it's just a lesser Jak 2. Then, the last game, also to come out for the PSP, was Jak and Dexter: The Lost Frontier, and this is the worst game of the entire franchise. If I have not been too critical of the other Jak games, I will be very critical of this one. So, The Lost Frontier is essentially a complete rip-off of the Clone Wars from Star Wars. In fact, some of the characters have the exact names from Star Wars. You fight air bandits. You don't even get to use your eco powers. Instead, you use weapons and mechs that allow you to use different sorts of eco abilities, and they give you different upgrades, and it's kind of like a morph gun for eco, so to speak. It is absolutely terrible. It is the worst Jak game of all time. And understandably, it's the last sole Jak and Dexter game to be released. Ever. It's also one of the last PlayStation 2 graphic-sensitive PSP games. If not one of the last PS2-influenced platformers. So, it's interesting that the entire existence of the Jak and Dexter games goes hand in hand with the release of the PlayStation 2. Jak and Dexter, the precursor legacy, comes along with the PlayStation 2, and as soon as the last PlayStation 2s go offline, the Jak and Dexter series stops getting new releases. On the whole, there isn't really a lot of novelty with The Lost Frontier. It feels like a rip-off of Star Wars, and it's not really that interesting, and I don't really recommend that you play it. The storyline and everything is terrible. I'm never going to play it. I don't recommend that you play it. And other than that, there has been some re-releases for the PS3 and PS4. Not really a significant difference. There's probably some trophies that you can get on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 that you didn't have on the PlayStation 2. Nothing is really different, though. There might be some different types of upgrades and vehicle modulars than Jak X Combat Racing for the PS4, since it was not released on PS3. And then there were some co-op games. So, if you remember about Smash Brothers, PlayStation has its own version of Smash Brothers, and sometimes you can get Jak as a playable character in PlayStation Smash Brothers or PlayStation Tournament Team. And around 2012, there was a game released that had it had Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Dexter, Sly Bandicoot, and some other character from the PS2 era, and you could play as them in different tournaments, and you're stranded in this far-off alien planet, and you have to play these different protagonist characters, and you do different missions and stuff. and I think it chiefly happens in Ratchet and Clank's universe or whatnot. And that's really about it. So, what about Jak and Daxter and the Ratchet and Clank rivalry? Well, Jak and Daxter was made by Naughty Dog Studio. Ratchet and Clank was made by Insomniac Studio. And actually, the programmers, the game designers, and the voice actors worked for both studios because they're under the Sony PlayStation umbrella. And so they worked together, and they actually, both industries borrowed a lot of concepts and secrets. So if you look through different Jak and Daxter games, you'll find tributes to Ratchet and Clank. If you play the earlier Ratchet and Clank games, you'll find tributes to Jak and Daxter and Spyro, because Spyro was what Insomniac Games was making before they did Ratchet and Clank. So that's interesting. And there was a bit of a rivalry between the studios on who could make the best PlayStation platformer. And the rivalry was interesting. I don't think it ever got to be like the Sonic and Mario wars between Nintendo and Sony. It was just sort of a joke, or more of a laughable joke. It wasn't anything to be taken serious or for granted. It's just more kind of like just a funny thing that they play on the fans back then. Anyway, Ratchet and Clank undoubtedly borrowed a lot of concepts from Jak and Daxter. The only difference, though, is that Ratchet and Clank games are still being released. Jak and Dexter have been a dead franchise for 14, 15 years. So, what happened? Well, Naughty Dog went on to making bigger and better things. They went on to doing Drake's Fortune, Uncharted, Drake's Fortune, and later Uncharted games. And the Uncharted games became very highly successful in the PlayStation 3 era, and Naughty Dog became highly acclaimed for their Uncharted games. Later, they released another game series that I can't think of, or whatever. It's about a girl or something, and it's kind of like Undead, the Undead series, but it's a video game. And so, Naughty Dog became very much acclaimed for these games, and they just kind of left Jak and Daxter behind. Also, the executives, and the directors have since retired, and new teams have come in, and nobody's really exactly that interested in going back and doing the earlier franchise-themed games, because Naughty Dog is mostly known for its very mature and highly graphic games. Yeah, that's it. That's it. The Last of Us. So, Naughty Dog has kind of been busy doing usually one-shot games like The Last of Us and the more popular Uncharted series. I don't even think they've released any new Uncharted game series either. However, there was an unreleased Jak and Daxter game called Jak 4 that was being made in 2006. However, it was cancelled. Naughty Dog cancelled the designs for Jak 4, and they changed it instead to Uncharted Drake's Fortune. And the gaming simulator that was going to be used for Jak 4 was instead used for Uncharted Drake's Fortune, which was released in 2007 for the PlayStation 3. So anyways, are there going to be any new Jak and Daxter releases? The sad answer is probably no, and that's rather unfortunate. But maybe at some point, some Sony gaming studio will try to make a new Jak and Daxter themed game. The only way that I see Jak and Daxter making a comeback is if it's in a Ratchet and Clank game, and it's like a co-op. Kind of like a double-player co-op, or like they come back to the Sony version of Super Smash Bros., but other than that, there's not going to be another solo Jak game, ever. So, it's a dead franchise, and it's really sad. But there's a lot of dead franchises like that. People have talked about for years about Spyro and Klonoa coming back, or making a comeback, and they never do. There hasn't been a new Klonoa game since 2008. And there hasn't, and actually that was just a re-release of an earlier game. There hasn't really been a new Klonoa game since probably 2003. Well, 2004. There has not been a new Jak and Daxter game since 2010, and there hasn't been a new Spyro game since 2018. So, it's really unfortunate, but that's just how the industry works. You have to understand that the gaming industry is full of nuances and full of risk-taking, and there's lots of new games that are coming out. The gaming franchise is thriving like never before in the face of Hollywood going into terminal decline with the woke shit. And it's unfortunate, but we probably will never see another Jak and Daxter themed game. At least not unless it's kind of like basically a co-op with other protagonists. Anyways, that's really about all that I had to say. I didn't intend for it to be a long stream.